All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. And it really is an honor to present this series. I know I've been working very hard on putting this together. And today we have our very esteemed co-guest speaker with me, Deb Simpson, who is an editor with the Journal of Graduate Medical Education and a senior medical educator. And so very excited to be here with you. Now, what I'd like to go ahead and do right now is just get us moving towards this idea of opening up that black box of peer review. And we might be asking ourselves, what is peer review? Why should we peer review? How can we peer review effectively? And, you know, it really is our goal just to take that black box and open up for all of us so we can really contribute to the process. And so what I do want to do is really acknowledge that as we get started with reviewing and knowing this idea of what to do and how can we do this process effectively, it can feel really challenging and overwhelming. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and ask everybody to go ahead and get in that chat box and let's do a little bit of crowdsourcing. So go ahead and pop into your response to what do you think peer review is? What is peer review to you? Deb, can we go back to that prior slide, please? Thank you. So go ahead and pop in the chat box. What is peer review to you? Novel manuscript, purpose of review acceptance, great. Critical appraisal, absolutely. Ahmed, thank you for sharing that. Sort of appraising something in a way that determines its value. Jason says a measure of quality control in the scientific process. Love that. Dominique, ensuring high quality articles, that they meet some standard. Karen, when you review your peers' work and maybe comment on the work. Thank you, Karen. Yes, absolutely commenting on the work 100%. Any other thoughts from anyone here today about what peer review is to you? Dominique, giving feedback, absolutely, a feedback conversation with the authors. Sue says checking the facts, absolutely. If people haven't done the appropriate literature review, really sort of thought about why the paper needs to be written, agree. Shuba, nurturing scholarship, absolutely love that, right? This idea of we are helping other people on their scholarship journey. These are all fantastic thoughts. Now, what I will say is the literature tells us a few things. So when a paper is published, it is because it passes some bar for a contribution to science. And so we do have the process to ensure that quality and ethicality of scholarship and that the work that we're reviewing follows proper scientific and educational approaches. Now, it's also the goal of peer review to evaluate findings for competence, for significance, and for originality. And so the goal here is that we take the peer reviews, aggregate them together to inform this sort of value judgment about the contribution of that scholarship. And one thing I want to make sure everyone is really clear on at this point is that this is an imperfect process because we use human judgment. But one key we want to remember is that there are multiple reviewers and there are multiple steps. And so that imperfect process is okay because it's part of one bigger whole. Now, I want everybody to just for a minute think about this the same way that we think about assessment of the individual learner. As educators, we provide just one observation as part of many. A single assessment is not going to make or break a decision about that learner. It's really about the trends and patterns coming together in the whole decision-making process. And that's the power of peer review. And so what I'd like to go ahead and do now is I'm going to ask Caitlin to open up the breakout rooms. We're going to go into small groups for just 4 minutes, and we're going to discuss one or both of these questions, and I'll pop them into the chat. So as an educator, why do you peer review? Or as a community of educators, why should we peer review? Welcome back, everybody. It looks like we still have a few people coming back, but I'd love to get some of the responses going. In our small groups, we discussed 2 questions. Who wants to share what you discussed?
Our group, I think the way I'd summarize it is we kind of thought about inward facing to ourselves and then also outward facing to our community, that there's a value to keep your critical thinking skills and appraisal skills strong by reviewing. You kind of keep your skills up by practicing. You can create awareness of the field by doing, by reviewing articles. But then as Vitas was kind of saying, it's also kind of a responsibility to the community to build a community and to ensure what's getting out there is at a high quality, because as a reviewer, you do have the chance to say that's not accurate or whatever it might be.
Absolutely love that. So this idea of we can grow as educators and we can also join a community of other educators. So love both of those comments. Any other groups have any thoughts about why they peer review?
It was mentioned about nurturing scholarship.
Yes, absolutely. Tell me more.
Well, Shuba actually mentioned it. She
A lot of things, one or two things. I said, it's not about criticizing or critiquing other people's scholarship. It's about nurturing scholarship. And I speak from a mentor frame of mind. And it's also an obligation to give back to the profession, a profession that's given a lot to us, and giving back to our young as well.
Absolutely. So giving back and also to helping ensure that others grow as scholars. I love that. I love that sentiment of sort of that growth mindset. Perhaps one other thought before we move on from anyone else.
From
Yes.
our group, Anna mentioned that, you know, when you have peer review, it helps with the validity of the project.
Can you elaborate?
Anna, you elaborate.
I think that I was kind of meaning that sometimes you can get kind of stuck in your own world. And so when you like open it up to get input from others, it's kind of show it and some other people agree with what you're saying, or you're able to engage in a larger conversation. I think it adds to the generalizability and validity that other people are finding kind of importance in what you're working on as well. And we talked about it also can help you kind of remove the blinders when you're in a project. You can sometimes get very blinded to any holes in the project, and bringing someone else in can help remove those blinders and bring in a fresh perspective.
Absolutely. So sometimes we get so close to our project that we can't see the flaws or areas that we aren't adequately covering, and peer review can help us see some of those and address them. So when the paper is published, it's much more adequate in terms of what we are contributing to the literature. So I love all of these sentiments. We do have to move forward. So next slide, Deb. So the literature tells us a few reasons why, and we actually covered most of these, right? Immersing ourselves in the culture of the field, having an important developmental activity that helps us grow, getting us involved in that scholarship community, engaging us in deliberate practice, that structured, repetitive, and effortful engagement that allows us to grow as a scholar, a writer, and a feedback giver. Some would argue that it is our ethical duty to share our expertise in pursuit of the common good. And then, of course, it does help with your reputation and your expertise. Next slide, please. Now, I will say, having worked with a lot of trainees and junior faculty, there are concerns about peer reviewing, these ideas of, am I qualified? Do I know enough? Can I do a good job? What if I'm wrong? What if I do the peer review wrong? I want everybody to know that these concerns are 100% natural. We all want to do a good job, but it can be hard if we don't feel that we adequately know how to do it. Well, if you have some subject matter expertise, if you have some methodological expertise, you can peer review. Junior people can peer review. So don't feel that you can't because you haven't experienced enough in your career yet. And I would just acknowledge you to sit with these feelings, recognize that they're real, and move past them, because today, and I'm going to hand off to Deb in just a moment, she's going to walk us through that peer review process and show us all of those steps that the paper goes through: editor, associate editor, other reviewers. So at the end, we'll realize that you are not the person making the decision about the peer review. It's the aggregate of all the information brought together. And so with that, I'm going to hand back over to Deb.
One of the things that came up from Dominique in our group is that she said it was fun to be a peer reviewer. Did anybody else raise that?
No, not so far.
Well, so if you're an editor and you want to assign a paper, we know it's going to Dominique because she thinks this is fun to do. We'll send it that way. But what Kristina and I thought might be helpful, and was helpful to me as someone before I became involved as a senior editor for a medical education journal, is, you know, it goes in this black box, and then what happens? And so there is a generic kind of process. It'll vary slightly by journal, but in general, they are handled the same way. So you've pressed that submit button. You've taken all this time and energy to get a manuscript in place, and you got the thank you, your manuscript is now under review confirmation email. So what happens then? So it's usually triaged by staff. And staff tend to look for technical issues, word length, structure, format, following guidelines. Is it got IRB if it needs it? Is the category a match? Is the subject a match? So for example, in the Journal of Graduate Medical Education, if this is about medical student education, it gets a technical reject because we only look at things that are pertaining to graduate medical education. The same with other journals. They all have a scope. So it's important to align that. Then it gets, once the staff are done, it gets signed to an editor or two. And that editor also takes a look at it and to see, gosh, have we just published a paper that's on this topic? Because journal space, even though things are typically all online, it's still a process and an effort. Is it a topic that's of interest to our readers? Generally, most papers are not internally rejected by an editor-in-chief is usually the person that takes a look at those, not just an editorial board member. So then it's sent out for peer review. And that varies by journal and its philosophy. Some of the journals are single blind reviews. So that's where the identity of the reviewer is anonymous, but the author's names are visible to the reviewers, or it could be double blinded. So both the reviewers and the identity of the authors are hidden. And I've seen examples in some of the newer open source where everything is open. So that part varies. It usually is described on the subject matter page, the instructions for authors page in the journal. And this process usually takes 20 days or so, sometimes 30, depending if it's been COVID and the influx of papers that arrived from 2019 that are just settling down. But how are reviewers identified? So if you've gotten a paper and sometimes you're like, how did I get this? And I didn't even sign up. You were invited to review. So what happens, we're just looking at one of the editor back end of the software program that people use various ones, but again, they all function pretty much the same. So this is for me. I've got a bunch of submissions with reviews complete. Now that doesn't mean I'm just a laggard, by the way. When I took this screenshot, it's because I'm responsible for the new ideas, which are like really good stuff in medical education. They're the short ones. And until the staff clears those out of my box to send decisions. So I'm not as delinquent as I look, but you can see that I've got a new assignment. So I get a notification by email, I get a new assignment, I come in, I click on it, and I see the title, the authors, so all the manuscript details, the manuscript number, we just black that out. Then I see what the classifications are, and I want to emphasize the author chooses these classifications. So when you are submitting a paper, it's really important to think about what classifications in that box. Don't just zip by, because that's part of the way that you decide who is going to review or not review. Because this is, I can search by classification match up here, which is all people in the reviewer database that have checked at least one of these, or I can search by specific individuals. So I think one of the things that we were talking about in our small group, if there are people with expertise in the field or doing something very similar or in the lead on it, I'd like that person to be a review. So I just search for their name. I have the ability to invite them if they're not in our system. And that's part of how the reviewer database gets up to date. So you can see for this article that was on programmatic efforts in graduate medical education, this was focused on how to deal with the challenge of recruitment of underrepresented minorities and diversity, not just for this paper, it wasn't just people of color, it was LGBTQ, other abled people, the whole range. So you can see that. And so when I search my classification category, I get a list, and it's usually a fairly long list, because you can see if I checked that I wanted accreditation process, I can agree or disagree. I clearly want diversity. I want residency application, etc. I can check which of those selected by the author do I want to look at. So health disparities was a match for one. Ooh, curriculum and health disparities. Not exactly a great match because this is on recruitment, but they're already an alternative reviewer. So when I'm searching, guess who comes up? Your very own Kristina Dzara. So what you're seeing again is the process by which if I clicked here, I could invite her, but I'm going to look and see a little more information. One, is she a member of the editorial board? Because we don't want to assign reviews to editorial board members. So this is a flag to not use that. But where's her classifications? Curriculum. Okay. So that's a match. I also happen to know that she's got other areas of expertise, such as faculty development, obviously. But this is what, if I click on her name, I get a whole lot more information. So this is like, AT&T collecting everything, or Google on the back end. There's a lot of data about reviewers on the back end. But surveys, survey design, scholarship, program evaluation, and oversight was what would attract me. So then the rest of that page with Kristina on it, this is her statistics. She doesn't have a review in progress, so that's a good thing because you don't want to send people more than one. Oh, she's only completed one review. Why is that? Well, it has to do with she hasn't been asked or invited to do more, because you can see that over here. She agreed, she declined 2, and she's had 3 total invitations. But the last time she agreed and completed one was in September of 2020. She declined one in the last one she declined. But here's pretty good. She does reviews quickly. We like to have people do reviews within 20 days. And if that, if you need a little longer and you ask for an extension, that's okay. But the longer reviewers take, the longer it takes to get a decision. But here's what's important. And you can say manuscript rating, average reviewer rating. What's that? Well, those are like ABCDs. It's a 51 to 100 typically scale. So that this is the average rating she gave to the manuscript she reviewed, which is kind of a high C, low B. So she's kind of a tough reviewer, which is okay. But this is the rating that the editors of that paper that she reviewed, after they got her review back, they took a look at the quality of her review. And that's a rock star review. So you always look for people who give really good reviews, who are constructive, who help move the paper forward, whether it's going to be for this journal or another journal, because it's part of what I think everyone talked about in their groups. It's part of this community and growth mindset. I think Shaba said that, Suba said that. It's growth. You're trying to coach people and make their work better if you can. So that looks promising, right? She looks like a reviewer. I could click here and just say invite, and that's how it would happen. Most journals invite at least 2 external reviewers, sometimes 3. And in that process of invitation, people can decline. And in fact, when I was talking with Kristina about it, she goes, "Is that bad that I decline?" And I said, "No. It is not bad. You are being a good member of the community and not accepting work that either isn't a match for you or you don't have the time at the moment, because delaying the process is a negative." So reviews are back, and they get adjudicated by at least one editor and typically in our system, 2 editors. And if it's, depends on who it is, if it's an associate editor and I have assigned it to them, then as a deputy editor, I would adjudicate it and the editor-in-chief would adjudicate it. But 2 is usually what happens. So one of the things, again, is that you consider mission space, what's been previously published. Because again, in the time frame of when this manuscript was submitted and when all the reviews are back, there may have been new work out. And what's a hot topic? What space is available? So we had a number of things that seemed promising prior to COVID, and then all of a sudden COVID hit. And in GME, there were a lot of articles that needed to get out quickly. So that meant our standards in terms of what we accepted had to change. That's sort of a rare. What happens, I get an email. All the reviews for X paper are completed. I go in the system and I view the reviews. So I see the reviewers' names. I see what they have recommended. So again, just because you make a recommendation doesn't mean that's what's going to happen to the paper. It informs the editor's recommendations. And you can typically, unless someone has written a very constructive major revision, or if they have given it a rating that's in that C range, it could be they're just a kind person and don't have the heart to say reject. So you look at it the same way, you know, when you're reading comments from a student and then you're reading their grades and they don't reconcile. Sometimes you read carefully the narrative review. Also, every editor reads in depth the review. Now, it's a debate amongst at least our editorial board members. Do they read the reviews prior to reading the paper, or do they read the paper ahead of time? I'm one that likes to have an independent judgment. I read the paper ahead of time, actually, before I assign reviewers. And then I refresh before I look at the reviews. So the reviews come in. I do have the ability to edit a review if there is something that is just grammar or whatever that would destroy the narrative. I do that. If the reviewer is unprofessional, if they are brutal, if they are way off base, either I delete that review and put a flag to the editor-in-chief to say, this review I would recommend not going out for these reasons when the feedback goes. I do try and summarize, as do others, what were the critical elements in that review, because usually there are strengths. But again, we want this to be a constructive process for members of our community. And all of our editors are people like you. We all submit papers and go through this process on the other end, which sometimes is painful. So we're trying to remember that these are our colleagues and people that we work with. So I make a recommendation. So you would see, once I had made mine, we just don't have deputy associate editors and deputy editors distinguished. And whether it's major revision, I make comments in private to the editor-in-chief, and I also make comments to the author and try and summarize. Because particularly sometimes, any of you ever gotten those reviewer 1 wants you to do this and reviewer 2 wants you to do the opposite? It's my job as an editor to try and help give some guidance if there are competing perspectives. And usually, if it's a methodology or some other piece, the competing way you resolve that is to say, please explain the why you chose this approach with some citations or evidence behind it. But again, trying to help. So the reviews are adjudicated. I can outright reject. I can outright recommend. These are all recommendations. So remember how many tiers we're at. Acceptance, again, considering, or revise and resubmit. If it's minor in our world and most, that's pretty much they're holding a slot for you in a future publication if the fixes are made. If it's a major, that is not in most journals a guarantee that you're going to get published. What it tells you is the journal is interested, that the topic is timely, that it's probably a fit, but there are serious concerns about the lit review, the methodology, the results, etc. So then it goes triage by editors if it's resubmitted, or some are not resubmitted. And that's why journals give 20 days or 30 days if we don't hear back from you, because then it drops out of the queue. Triage, the same process. Now you can decide to send it out or not to send it out. So if it's a minor, it rarely goes back out. If it's a major, it typically goes back out. And it can go out to new reviewers, or it can go out to a combination of someone who was a really super constructive reviewer and wrote during the first cycle, plus a new person. It just is variable depending on what the issue is. Those reviews are then adjudicated. We on occasion have said, if it was a major, then it goes to a minor, or it's still a major. We've had that on one that I was just involved in because it was such a cool topic, but they hadn't done it yet. They hadn't gotten it. So tried to give them more guidance. And then what happens? It's about a 30-day if never resubmitted. Hopefully it's accepted at some phase in this. And our rates aren't that much different. We range 7 to 15% depending on what category. Some categories have higher acceptance rates at 15% than others are tougher. Our average in 2021 was close to 10. In academic medicine, it's 10 to 15, med ed, it's 8 to 12, and advances in health professions education, it's about 10 to 15. Again, those go up and down a little, but you can see it's somewhere hovering, usually between 8 and 12% for most journals. So your 1 in 10 chance. Ugh, tough, but keep working at it. So review is 1 to 6 and then publish. Our goal is to get everything that we accept from the moment it enters the system to publication in less than a month, or less than a year. Less than a month would be amazing, sorry, less than a year. So that's the generic manuscript review process. Are there things that surprise you about that?
Not a lot of comments about what surprised in the chat. I do have a great question from Vigalis. He asked, if a publication is accepted with major revisions, then will it be reviewed from the same reviewers that reviewed the first submission?
So if I heard correctly, it said accepted with major revision.
That's what the question says, but I think it would be received major revisions.
Yeah, because normally, does anybody know a journal where you can be accepted and required to do a major revision?
Not accepted. I think Vagelis may have been referring to a paper of ours. So in general, yeah, major revisions. And does the editor have to send it back to the peer reviewers? I think Deb, you had already said that the editors can decide whether to review the responses and see if all the major comments have been addressed. Yeah. Correct?
Exactly, Dr. Ramani. It is.
Oh, Shubha's fine, please.
It is. How dramatic are the revisions? Is the paper fundamentally different? That goes out typically to new reviewers because it's almost a new paper. If it's kind of a combination of addressing and cleaning up, or there was vague, some of the things that happen is the methodology is vague. You can't visualize actually what happens, or there's serious questions about the decisions made in the methodology. that sometimes can't be resolved and are fatal flaws, but you don't know that on the first review. Those will go back typically to a previous reviewer plus a new one. That is at the discretion of the editors, and most journals don't have a hard and fast rule. The key though, and I think you're doing that later, and we've done some sessions on how do you respond to reviewers. And everyone says, lay it out. Here's the comment, here's the response, here's the why, or if you couldn't respond or why. Kind of think in a 3-column view. That really helps the editor to see what you have done and why you did it. And sometimes you can't do things and you don't put that in the paper, but you can put that in a comments to the editor in response to that particular constructive feedback about that occurred in the review.
I absolutely agree with you, Deb. I'm a big fan of preparing a response to reviewers' document, even if the journal doesn't require it, really going line by line to say how I, as an author, addressed those comments and thoughts from the reviewers. We've got 2 great questions in the chat. I'm wondering if it's all right to take them, Deb?
Sure.
Fantastic. So Aline wants to know, if a certain publication is rejected, is there any chance for it to be accepted a year later after a great amount of improvement, or is there no hope, so you don't need to try?
Well, the first suggestion would be change the title. But it would, because even rejected papers stay in the back end of the database. And if you've really reworked it, maybe it should probably have a new theme or a new emphasis. So I'm not being flippant just to parade the system, but to make it clear what that focal point is, because if it was rejected, yeah, sometimes journals will say, including us, we are interested in this paper but cannot accept it in its current form. If you want to consider submitting again, it would be a new submission. And that's how most journals handle it. But you do need to be upfront in your letter to the editor. This was a paper that was previously reviewed. It's now, we have substantially overhauled, use dramatic words so that it's clear it isn't the same paper. And we now think it is appropriate and a good match for this journal.
Thank you, Deb. And we were also wondering about recommending reviewers. When you're submitting your article and it asks you to recommend reviewers, how can you choose, and how often are those people chosen by the editors?
That's a philosophical question that various editors answer differently. I personally look at those. I sometimes investigate. So if it's people that you have published with before, I will look at the authors who are the submitting authors and see if they have published with these people previously. Then that's a conflict of interest. Even if they're not at the same institution, sometimes, people move around, but I do take them. I don't take them blindly. I do a lit search on those suggested reviewers to make sure they have expertise in the area. And if they do, and they're not in our system, we'll add them and invite them. But typically, not all external reviewers are recommended by the authors. At least one is an independent.
Fantastic. And why don't we take one more question, Deb, before we move forward with the rest of the session. We've got a great question from Irene here. If you're a reviewer and you suggested major revisions, and then the journal asks you again, can you look at this article? Is it poor form to say, no, I don't want to review again, and let other reviewers take a look at it?
Absolutely. Remember, you just act as the professionals you are, and to say, I'm declining, I have a conflict of interest, this is a paper that I feel like I've already given constructive feedback to, my time is not available. Sometimes people give us comments as to why, and other times they don't. Again, though, it is important if you're going to decline, to do that fairly quickly so it doesn't remain out in space. Many journals, by the way, for reviewers have a time frame to respond, which is a week or 10 days. And then they have a window to get your review in. And those are two separate things to keep the review cycle going.
Okay. Thank you, Deb. What do you think about moving on? And then we'll have some time at the end for more questions.
Sounds good.
Fantastic. Can you move forward to the next slide? So you might be wondering, how do I actually become a reviewer? And the first thing is to know the landscape of medical and health professions education journals. So what journals do you read? What's your favorite journal? What journals align with your work? That's going to be the first place that you can start, because you would likely be most comfortable since you have a sense of the journal because you've read it and it's in the space in which you work. Now, you can absolutely email journal editors, email journals, and express interest. This is really true right now. Journals are hungry for reviewers. If you want to be a peer reviewer, you can be a peer reviewer. And publishing in the journal is very easy. Publishing in the journal is an easy way to get on that review list. And if you do publish a paper in a journal, it's very respectful to serve as a reviewer for that journal at least once, to give back to the publication process. Deb already covered a few of these other things, but if you are asked to review, accept or decline early. If you can do it and you want to do it, say yes and do it. If you can't, let them know early, because they need to move on to the next potential reviewer. It is okay to decline poor fits. If a journal emails you and it's completely out of your scope, feel free to decline. It is okay to ask for very brief extensions if you need a little bit more time in order to complete your review. And then do let the editor know if you have any potential conflicts or concerns. If there's anything that you think the editor should know about your ability to review that manuscript, do let them know they want to know. Next slide.
Yeah, Kristina, before we move, the
Sure.
other thing to let the editor know is, if you don't have if you have methodological expertise but not the content, or vice versa, that helps, because sometimes reviewers are selected ideally for both, but sometimes you can't find both.
Absolutely. That's a really great point, Deb. I know I was peer reviewing once, and the statistical method that they used was beyond my understanding. I was not familiar with it. And I made a point to the editor to say, I think it would be wise to make sure that you have a reviewer who understands this statistical method so that we can be certain that the authors applied it accurately and correctly. So great point, Deb. Now, I want to just shout out to everybody that sometimes you may be asked to peer review and you need to sort of use your good judgment and go with your gut. Now, I have absolutely nothing against the journal Sustainability, nothing, no offense to them, but they emailed me out of the blue. I have never heard of them. I have never read their journal. So I read their email and I saw a couple of things that sort of gave me pause, right? So first, the manuscript title, it did not align with what I view as my areas of expertise. Second, they mentioned a discount voucher for a future publication in the journal. This gets me thinking maybe they just want me to submit a paper to them so that I will pay fees if it's published. When you get an email like this, when you get an opportunity to review like this, and some things sort of feeling maybe not 100% right, you have a couple of options. And so first, it really is okay to do your due diligence. Go to the journal website directly. See if it seems legit. The other thing you can do is you can ask a mentor whether they've heard of the journal, what they think, whether they think you should peer review for the journal. Another thing you can do, we know that there's a lot of phishing going on. Check with IT before you click it. Make sure it's legit, or is this some sort of spam campaign? And finally, you can always check with your librarian. Ask them, where is it indexed? In what locations is it indexed? Because if the journal's not indexed in some high quality locations, then it may be a sign that it's not a legit journal and you may want to decline. Other thoughts on that, Deb?
I think you've covered it. I also would look at the papers published in that journal.
Absolutely.
And see if they're kind of in the scope.
Great.
But be very careful. The phishing has been active. If they're giving you a discount, look on the website. Is there a submission fee? Many of us still think that there shouldn't be a for-profit, even though there is, but it shouldn't cost us, and that really hampers people who are not in an economic situation to afford it. And some of these submission fees are based on page length, or they require editing. There's all kinds of back ends. So be very careful. Our librarians are superb at nosing out these kind of journals.
Absolutely. And, our BEI librarian, Sue Worthman, would absolutely be able to help us out to determine where a journal is indexed and whether this might be something that we want to do or decline. And Dominique points out, Google the impact factor, see the impact factor. They have an impact factor that could also give us some clues as to whether it's a legit journal. So next slide.
Oh, I do have one question though, Kristina. Sure. Why do they think you would be a good reviewer for refugees and migrants in an elderly healthcare sector?
I have absolutely no idea, because that is not what I view my areas of scholarship to be. So I felt very comfortable and confident immediately declining it and then screenshotting it for the session. All right. We've all heard of the reviewer number 2, right? That person who is cantankerous, that person who is negative towards the paper and does not give that formative feedback to improve. So we do not want to be reviewer number 2. And there are a couple of things that we can do to not be that person. And the first thing is, when you're asked to peer review, read the journal guidelines to reviewers. Every journal has guidelines to reviewers. This is their map of what you should be looking for and why. And through this, as well as having read the journal, you want to understand that journal, you want to understand their audience, and you want to understand their publication criteria, right? A higher or more prestigious journal may have more rigid publication criteria than, say, a lower level journal. So you want to understand those things as you go into the peer review. Another thing you always want to do is thoroughly read that paper. It's part of your duty as a reviewer. If you agree to review, read the manuscript fully, really try to understand what the authors did. You do want to exhibit that professionalism and respect throughout. No matter what, the authors worked hard on their manuscript. Even if it needs a lot of work, the authors worked very hard. And you always want to be respectful of the time and effort that they put into their scholarship. You never want to suggest major changes in methodology, right? The authors can't travel back in time and do a completely different study, and it's not helpful to them, anybody really, for you to suggest that. You do want to be organized and actionable. Now, in the review report, you can walk through each section of the paper. Focus on that big picture. Focus on the big picture things that the authors would have to do to move this paper to publication. And I will point out, Azer et al., Shuba is an author on that manuscript. They have a very nice table for what you can think about by section. You do want to be formative, and you do want to be supportive. We've heard earlier about taking this as a feedback, taking this as a mentoring. Use that mentoring mindset. Provide that formative feedback. It's not your goal to get this paper published in that journal, but it is your goal to give them formative feedback to improve. Watling et al. Point out that it's really ideal to engage in a conversation with the authors, right? You want to talk not at them, but you want to talk in a conversational style with them. So, engage in that conversation with them in your review, but don't try to show off how much you know or how much smarter you are than them, which some reviewers do. And then at the end, you really want to come together to summarize those strengths and weaknesses of the manuscript, and you want to make clear whether you think it addresses an important issue. And always make a clear recommendation. Is it accept, reject, or revise and resubmit? Choose from the options that the journal has and feel confident in your choice. We've talked about this before, but always letting the editor know if you're on the fence about something, if you're not sure about something, if you don't have the expertise in something, just let the editor know. And then I do want to point out that there can be a little bit of uncertainty regarding how much of my own time do I put into the peer review process. And so I do like that Watling article, because they recommend you take an hour, you read the paper, and you make some notes. Then you take a pause, you take a little brain break, and then you come back when you're ready and you take about 1 more hour to craft your review. And they point out that if it takes longer than this, it can actually be a sign that the paper has too many flaws and it should be rejected. So your goal is not to get into the weeds, but your goal is really to focus on that big picture of whether the paper is publishable and what it would take to get there. And so with that, I'm going to hand off to Deb, who will offer us a few more points.
Yeah, I actually, if there's one paper you're going to read from today, I would suggest Chris Watling's paper, the 2021. It is really a great guide on how to be a good reviewer and not to be the person that nobody wants to hear from. And I'll just do this isn't a paid political announcement, but Chris Watling and Laura Lee Lingard have written this wonderful book that's very approachable with small chapters, and it's called Story Not Study, 30 Brief Lessons to Inspire Health Researchers as Writers. And it's really about telling a story. And often what happens to reviewers is you can't follow the story. And so I have been actually making some recommendations of various chapters to people when they're stuck and how to improve their writing. So that would be a great addition to all of your library. Again, not a paid political announcement. It just came up because it's short, smart, cogent chapters. Despite Dominique, who's the one who's like fun and I can do this, a lot of people think that peer reviewing is hard work and it's isolating. You often do it in your off hours when you might be with family or friends or late at night. It doesn't have to be a solitary event. And almost all major med ed journals now have a way to do either a mentored or a group peer reviewed process. And what happens is you get a person like Kristina, who's been a reviewer for us. She says, hey, I want to do a group peer review. So that way I can just look for one that's in her area, assign it to her so that it still operates in the system. And then it gets all the inputs. We usually do it in about an hour, and that takes that time. And then someone consolidates that rule. I talk to your senior mentors or senior colleagues and ask them if you can join in a review. And if you're interested in doing one as a group for us, let Kristina know and we'll set one up. We'd happy to do that. The key though is you've done your review. Most journals give you back the review you did as well as the other reviewers and the decision. Compare your review with other reviewers and the editor's comments. You can actually ask the editors for feedback. So don't ask the editor-in-chief if there is another editor that was assigned. Ask them. And then reflect on your own learning. List the review on your CV. These are all kind of obvious. But recently, some of the editorial board members for JGME said, there's some more we need to do. Reviewing is hard work, and it's a really important part of the scholarship of our community. So we had an action box. It was published as an editorial, I think in June. It's in the references. But record the number of reviews you do by journal with the final dispositions. So looking for your concordance, are you one that matches the editor? Or are you off whack? That'll give you some growth and opportunity. Add the review work with quality and quantity examples from the journal, not just to your CV, depending on the format that your organization goes, or to a portfolio, but to your annual performance review, to your academic websites. And then advocate. Ask journals for reviewer metrics. So every journal has a way that they judge reviewers, whether it's formal or informal. But typically the larger journals all have, as you could see, like Kristina's, a score. Speak up regarding the value of taking the time to review. Just like there are fabulous teachers who are not great mentors, and there are fabulous people that are working with struggling learners, not everyone is great at everything. And there are some people that are fabulous reviewers. They advance our scholarship. So talk to your promotion and tenure committees about that. And you can use the same classic arguments that everyone uses. So that's a strength. We'd love for this dialogue to increase the value of peer reviewed. So I personally want to thank you for being part of this community. It's an exciting group, and all of the work you all do. It's an honor. And I'll turn it back over to Kristina.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to Deb for sharing all of your expertise with us today. To have somebody who is on the editorial board able to walk us through that process is really exciting. And I know that we all learned a bunch today. This QR code that you see right here and the link that I'm putting into the chat, I prepared a BEI bundle for everybody. So all of the articles that we mentioned today, they're all collated in one place with links for you to find them. So if you're interested in following up on any self-directed learning, go ahead and scan that QR code or click that link and you'll have direct access to that bundle. I know we have just about a minute left. Does anyone have one final burning question or reflection from our learning today? Go ahead and unmute and share.
If I may, Kristina.
Yes, sure.
I did pass a comment about scholarship, and I've been reading Deb Simpson's articles forever. It's nice to meet you, at least in a square box, finally.
Oh, I'm sorry, Suba, that's painful to have read these.
No, I still use them. Yours, Janet Hafler's, and but besides that, one thing I have been talking about, and I think teaching and learning in medicine has been talking about a lot too, is scholarship is, in most of the med-ed journals, is viewed from a very, very Western or Eurocentric perspective. I think it's time to move on and talk about rigor differently. And I keep arguing, of late, I've been getting vociferous about this argument, which is, I think we need to be humble. Well, I moved to the West, but originally came from the East. But I think I want to go back and forth and share rather than give to the rest of the world. So I think we need to start exploring cross-cultural perspectives of rigor and scholarship.
Suba, you have highlighted a super hot topic amongst journal editors. And,
all right. Yeah, absolutely. Final thoughts, Deb, before we close the session right on time.
Thank you to all. Keep doing the great work you're doing to keep education visible, and a special shout out Tony Artino, who put some of the workflow together, and I think you're having it a later session.
Yes, Tony will be joining us, I believe, in May for a session about his program on meta scholarship and meta research. So we will look forward to that. With that, thank you everybody for sharing your hour with us. It has been a joy having you. And don't forget, we have 2 more in the series. The next one coming up is led by Shuba and I, and we welcome all of you to join us. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day.